The call came just after midnight, a jagged rip through the quiet hum of my home lab. I'd been cataloging soil samples from a cold case, the scent of damp earth and decay still clinging to my fingertips. The caller, a lead detective I knew only by a clipped, professional tone, sounded urgent, almost rattled. "Blake, we've got something you need to see. Remote dig site. Ancient, they say. But not entirely." I packed my kit with practiced efficiency, each instrument finding its place with a metallic click. The drive was long, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to little more than a muddy track winding through dense, ancient forest. My headlights cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating gnarled tree trunks that seemed to lean in, whispering secrets. Finally, the forest thinned, revealing a clearing bathed in the harsh, artificial glow of portable floodlights. A makeshift encampment of tents and excavation equipment marred the natural landscape. Uniformed officers moved with a subdued efficiency, their hushed voices barely carrying over the distant hoot of an owl. A canvas tent, larger than the others, stood at the center, its flaps pulled back to reveal the heart of the operation. The lead detective, a stocky man with a perpetual frown etched between his brows, met me at the perimeter. "Glad you could make it, Dean. This one's different." His gaze flickered towards the tent, a hint of genuine unease in his eyes. He didn't elaborate, simply gestured me inside. The interior of the tent was a maelstrom of activity, albeit a controlled one. Archaeologists, their faces smudged with dirt, hovered around a deep, meticulously excavated pit. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and something else, something ancient and stagnant, like undisturbed dust mixed with a faint, metallic tang. My boots crunched on loose earth as I approached the edge of the excavation. Below, nestled in the exposed earth, lay a skeleton. It was undeniably old, the bones bleached to a brittle ivory, fused seamlessly with the surrounding sediment. The posture was contorted, unnatural, limbs splayed in a pose that suggested violence, not natural burial. My mind immediately began to calculate, to catalog the indicators of age, trauma, taphonomy. This was a ritualistic killing, no question. The positioning, the obvious implement, it spoke of intent, of purpose. Then I saw it. Etched into the surface of the exposed femurs, stark against the ancient bone, were symbols. Not ancient runes, not weathered pictographs, but crisp, precise markings. Geometric patterns, sharp angles, and an unnervingly familiar stylized crescent. They looked fresh, as if carved yesterday, not centuries ago. My breath hitched. The impossible stared back at me. "We found it this morning," a lead archaeologist, a woman with tight gray braids and a face lined by sun and concentration, explained, her voice tight with disbelief. "Thought it was a new cultural layer at first. But these are impossible. They don't belong." She pointed a gloved finger at the markings, her hand trembling slightly. I knelt, peering closer, my investigative lens already engaged. The cuts were too clean, too sharp for any tool from the era of the skeleton. There was no weathering, no patination matching the bone's age. It was like a vandal had defaced a priceless museum exhibit. But here, the exhibit was still buried, undisturbed for centuries until now. "These symbols," I murmured, more to myself than to them. "I've seen them before." The words tasted like ash. Not on ancient bones, no, never on ancient bones. But in files, in photographs from recent, unresolved cases. Cult activity, fringe groups, isolated incidents that had baffled local law enforcement for years. The same stylized crescent, the same angular patterns. This wasn't merely an archaeological find, it was a crime scene spanning millennia. The lead detective cleared his throat. "We've secured the site, of course. No one's touched anything beyond the initial discovery and exposure. But we don't even know where to. Begin processing something like this. We begin by treating it as two distinct events, I stated, my voice firm despite the internal tremor. An ancient murder and a modern defilement. Or something far more unsettling. I pulled out my forensic photography kit, the familiar weight of the camera a grounding presence. I need detailed shots, context shots, close-ups of those markings. Every angle. Then we'll need to carefully extract the remains, preserving every scrap of evidence. My mind raced, connecting disparate fragments of information. A local legend, whispered in hushed tones, of a bloodthirsty cult that vanished centuries ago, leaving only cryptic symbols in their wake. I dismissed it as folklore, the stuff of campfire tales. But these markings, they were too specific, too potent to be mere coincidence. I'll need to send some bone fragments. Soil samples from directly beneath and around the markings, for dating and residue analysis, I told the detective. Once we have them, they'll need to go to the police department basement holding forensic samples. It's the most secure location for preliminary processing before more specialized labs get involved. The detective nodded, already pulling out his radio. Get a transport team ready. Dr. Blake needs samples moved with extreme care. As the camera flashed, illuminating the impossible juxtaposition of ancient death and modern desecration, I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. This wasn't just a puzzle, it was a warning. Someone wasn't just imitating history, they were trying to finish it. And I had a sickening feeling that this ancient skeleton, with its freshly carved wounds, was only the first chapter. My determination hardened, resolving into a steely resolve. I had to decipher this past, before the present claimed more victims. The biting wind that whipped across the dig site followed me, a phantom chill burrowing deep into my bones, long after I'd left the exposed earth and its ancient secrets behind. The images of that unearthed form, the impossible precision of its demise, flashed behind my eyes. Someone wasn't just imitating history, they were trying to finish. The thought was a cold, hard knot in my gut. Finish what? That was the question that gnawed at me, overriding the fatigue from the long day. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start looking. My journey led me away from the desolate rural landscape and into the city's grim, utilitarian heart. The building was a monolith of concrete and tired brick, its windows reflecting the fading twilight like vacant eyes. Inside, the air grew cooler, heavier, as I descended flight after flight of stairs, the fluorescent hum growing louder with each level. Finally, I pushed through a heavy steel door, the sound echoing in the cavernous space beyond. A place of sterile precision and quiet desperation. Rows of refrigerated lockers lined one wall, their metallic sheen reflecting the harsh overhead lights. Workstations, each equipped with microscopes, various chemical reagents, and an array of specialized tools, stood like lonely sentinels in the vast, echoing space. The air hung thick with the faint, cloying scent of preservatives and something else, something metallic and faintly organic, the lingering aura of countless past investigations. I located the designated bay, a stainless steel table already prepped with a sterile blue sheet. The evidence custodian, a woman with tired eyes and a perpetually harried expression, met me there. She didn't speak, simply gesturing to a series of evidence bags neatly arranged on a nearby cart. The bags contained samples taken from the ancient site, soil, bone fragments, remnants of the binding material. Most critically, a small, carefully extracted piece of the ancient victim's skull. Just the skull fragment first, I murmured, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. And any trace evidence collected from the immediate vicinity of the head wound. She nodded, her movements practiced as she retrieved the requested bags. I pulled on my gloves, the thin latex of familiar second skin. My determination sharpened, pushing away the lingering unease. This was my domain, where facts, not feelings, held sway. Under the bright glare of the stereo microscope, the fragment of bone became a landscape of minute detail. I began with a visual inspection, noting the subtle discoloration, the patterns of erosion indicative of millennia spent underground. Then I focused on the specific trauma site. The ancient blow, delivered with brutal force, had left a distinctive stellate fracture pattern. The edges were rounded, smoothed by time, but the underlying geometry was clear. A crushing impact, not a cutting one. An anomaly. Nestled deep within one of the ancient fracture lines, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a minute speck of something alien. It was too bright, too geometrically perfect to be a natural inclusion from the dig site. I carefully maneuvered the fragment, adjusting the magnification. The speck resolved into a tiny, almost iridescent shard. It looked like a synthetic polymer, a modern plastic, barely the size of a pinhead. How could something like this be embedded in bone that had been buried for centuries? My brow furrowed. I meticulously documented its location, photographed it, and then, with a pair of ultrafine tweezers, I painstakingly extracted it, placing the minuscule shard into a separate evidence file. This wasn't just contamination, it was intrusion. Someone had handled this ancient skull, and recently, and carelessly. The reenactment wasn't just symbolic, it was physical. Next, I examined the trace evidence from the binding material. The ropes that had secured the ancient victim were organic, degraded, but a residue remained. Under UV light, a faint, almost imperceptible sheen became visible, clinging to some of the ancient fibers. I took a swab, the cotton tip turning a ghostly blue under the specialized light. This wasn't natural luminescence. This was a chemical signature, a subtle phosphorescence that spoke of modern handling. Someone had touched these bindings, perhaps even reinforced them, leaving behind a contemporary trace. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. The ancient ritual wasn't simply being imitated. The body itself, or at least elements of the original crime scene, had been disturbed, perhaps even staged again. This wasn't just a copycat. This was an active participant, manipulating the past in the present. I pushed back from the microscope, my mind racing. The specific details of the ancient murder, the unique head trauma, the precise binding, the seemingly ritualistic placement, were too specific to be coincidence, especially with the modern intrusions. This wasn't random. It had to be deliberate. I turned to my personal laptop, its screen a glowing rectangle in the dim light of the basement. I had brought a few local history books from the site, dog-eared and heavy with age, along with some digital archives I'd accessed. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing keywords: ancient sacrifice, local cult, blood ritual, stargazing mountain. The last term was a local colloquialism for the remote plateau where the dig was located. It didn't take long. The search results coalesced around a forgotten local legend, dismissed by most as folklore, but meticulously recorded in a single, obscure historical text from the late 19th century. I found the relevant passage, my eyes scanning the faded script. It described a sacrifice to the hungry earth, performed when the twin stars aligned. The victim, always a stranger, was to be bound with sacred hemp and offered at a specific stone altar, their skull open to the sky with a ceremonial bludgeon. Every detail, from the binding material to the method of death, the specific location, even the mention of a stranger, it all mirrored the ancient body unearthed at the dig. And the twin stars aligned? That was the phrase the lead archaeologist had used when describing the unusual celestial event that marked the supposed time of the ancient death. This wasn't just a legend. It was a blueprint. And the contemporary intrusions on the ancient remains, the synthetic polymer, the phosphorescent residue, they weren't just anomalies. They were proof. The tension in the quiet basement became a palpable weight, pressing down on me. The race had begun. My blood ran cold, not with cliché, but with a sudden, profound internal chill. And the twin stars aligned? That was the phrase. The exact, chilling phrase I deciphered from the weathered fragments of the local legend, a dark, forgotten piece of folklore I dismissed as mere myth-making until now. The legend spoke of a sacred alignment, a specific celestial event that would empower the ritual. It was a detail so obscure, so precise, it couldn't be coincidence. I stood there, the phone pressed hard against my ear, the detective's voice a distant buzz against the rising tide of my own thoughts. The implication solidified into a concrete, horrifying truth: this wasn't just an imitation. This was a continuation. Someone wasn't merely reenacting history, they were actively fulfilling a prophecy. A prophecy that, if I remembered correctly, concluded with a devastating act of completion. Dean? You still there? The detective's voice snapped me back. I'm here, I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. The new victim. Are the details identical? There was a pause, a heavy sigh on the other end. Look, Dean, I know you're invested in the ancient stuff, but this is a live investigation. We've got a body, a fresh crime. We're looking for a modern killer, not some cult from 1,000 years ago. Just tell me, I insisted, a sharp edge entering my tone. Was the victim found bound? With cordage made from plant fibers? They were the wrists and ankles secured in a specific, almost ceremonial manner? Another pause, longer this time. Yes. And yes, the binding was intricate. Not what you usually see. And the method of death. A single, precise incision to the carotid. Was it near an old, significant landmark? A place that might hold historical or legendary importance? It was found in the old quarry, near the standing stones, the detective admitted, a hint of grudging respect in his voice, quickly followed by suspicion. How did you know that? The standing stones, I murmured, ignoring his question. The quarry was where the ancient cult was said to have held its most significant rituals, where they believed the veil between worlds was thinnest. The legend states the first sacrifice would be made at the quarry, mirroring the ancient rite. This isn't just a copycat, detective. This is a sequence. Sequence, the detective scoffed. Dean, we're talking about a dead man in a quarry. We're looking for a perp, not deciphering scrolls. We've got the evidence locker opened for you. Just focus on the physical evidence, okay? Leave the folklore to the historians. The line clicked dead. I gripped my phone, my knuckles white. Skepticism was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had to see the evidence with my own eyes. The drive to the station was a blur. The city lights, usually a comforting hum, now felt like a frantic, blinking warning. The elevator descended with a metallic groan, carrying me deeper into the building's concrete foundations. Rows of steel lockers lined the walls, each one a silent repository of shattered lives and unsolved mysteries. The air was cool, smelling faintly of disinfectant and stale paper. A uniformed officer, a young man with nervous eyes, stood by an open evidence locker, a plastic-wrapped bundle resting on a steel table. Professor Blake, the officer asked. His voice hushed in the quiet space. Dean, I corrected, my gaze already fixed on the package. Just Dean. He nodded. Stepping back. The detective said you'd want to see this. Initial findings from the quarry victim. I approached the table, my breath catching in my throat. Inside the clear evidence bag, meticulously preserved, were the bindings. They were identical in material and weave to the ancient cords I'd painstakingly analyzed just days ago. My fingers twitched, an urge to touch, to feel the texture, to confirm what my eyes already knew. The victim was found north-northeast. The alignment of the twin stars during the time of the ancient cult's rituals. The prophecy. And the incision? I asked, opening my eyes. The officer pointed to a smaller bag containing a blood-stained cloth. Clean. Single stroke. Looks like a very sharp, thin blade. No hesitation marks. I leaned closer to the bindings, observing the specific knot pattern, the way the fibers were twisted, the deliberate placement around where the victim's wrists and ankles would have been. It was a signature. And it's only the beginning. My voice was steady, firm, stripped of any lingering doubt. The skepticism of others wouldn't deter me. The past wasn't just bleeding into the present, it was actively reaching for its future, and I was the only one who saw the pattern forming. It's a statement. A chillingly precise echo across millennia. The drive back to the city was a blur of rain-streaked windows and my own churning thoughts. The ancient binding pattern, the deliberate placement of the fibers, it wasn't random. And the implications of that intent, reaching across such a vast expanse of time, settled a cold dread in my gut. I knew I needed to dive deeper into the local history, into the forgotten corners of this region's past, and I knew just the person to help me navigate that labyrinth. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on rows of evidence lockers and stacked cardboard boxes. The scent of antiseptic and old paper was a constant companion down here. I had commandeered a corner, pushing aside a trolley laden with crime scene tape and empty evidence bags. Spread across a battered metal table were digital printouts of the ancient texts I'd managed to secure from the dig's preliminary scans, alongside a stack of local historical society archives. Across from me, an older man with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on the end of his nose, the regional history professor, squinted at a faded reproduction of an old parchment. His fingers, stained with ink from years of handling brittle manuscripts, traced the archaic script. I had pulled him from his quiet university office with a single, urgent call, promising him a mystery far more compelling than any academic conference. He'd arrived with a satchel overflowing with even more obscure texts and a look of profound curiosity. "This is fascinating, Dean," the professor murmured, his voice a dry rustle. "These symbols. Active, or so the legends claim, around the same period as your unearthed victim." He pushed a brittle, leather-bound book toward me. Its pages were filled with detailed sketches and dense, looping script. They believed in a cyclical cleansing, a ritual to reset the land. To appease a forgotten earth spirit they called the root feeder. I leaned in, my gaze fixed on a particular drawing, a stylized thorny vine encircling a figure bound at the wrists and ankles, eerily similar to the impression left in the earth at the dig site. "The bindings," I said, pointing. "The knots. Are they described here?" The professor nodded, flipping a few pages. "Indeed. The choke knot of the root feeder. Meant to sever the spirit from the body, allowing it to be absorbed back into the earth, nourishing the cycle. A symbolic return, they believed, to ensure bountiful harvests and ward off blight. The one found last night?" I pushed a laminated photograph across the table, a blurred image of the second victim, taken before their removal. The image, though grainy, still showed the unmistakable pattern of restraints. The bindings were identical. Not just similar, but precise. The same method, the same placement. The professor adjusted his spectacles, his eyes widening slightly as he studied the photograph. Remarkable. The cult's rituals were highly specific. They believed the offering had to be unblemished, pure, in their archaic terms. And the sacrifice itself. It wasn't merely death. It was a release. The first victim, ancient, had shown evidence of a precise piercing wound. The second, modern, had been found with a similar, carefully executed injury. This wasn't just imitation, it was adherence. They had a prophecy, didn't they? I pressed, my voice low. Something about the completion that you mentioned. The professor cleared his throat. Yes. They believed that if the ritual was interrupted or incomplete, the spirit of the sacrificed would linger, unable to return to the earth, causing an imbalance. To rectify this, a final offering was required, one that would reforge the broken chain. It spoke of 3 sacrifices: the seed, the sprout, and the fruit. The ancient one, the seed. The recent one, the sprout. I looked at the professor, the implication hanging heavy in the air between us. That means the killer is preparing for the fruit. They're not just reenacting history, they're trying to complete it. The professor's face was pale. The prophecy also mentions a specific time. A convergence of celestial events, tied to the full moon and the autumnal equinox. A blood moon they called it, though not in the astronomical sense. The autumnal equinox was less than a week away. The next full moon was 2 days after that. The window was closing. The killer wasn't just mirroring the past, they were meticulously following a blueprint, racing against a deadline set millennia ago. The details were too specific, the parallels too exact. And if the killer truly believed in completion, then the fruit was coming, and I had mere days to stop it. The details were the key, the terrifying, undeniable links between the ancient past and the bloody present. I stared at the calendar on my tablet, the digital dates mocking me with their relentless march. The autumnal equinox, less than a week away. The next full moon, 2 days after that. The window was closing. I knew where the killer would strike next. Or, at least, I knew the type of location. The legend, dismissed for centuries as mere folklore, outlined a sequence. The first sacrifice, unearthed at the dig site, was the initiate, bound to the earth. The recent victim, the watcher, found overlooking the river, was a guardian of the threshold. This wasn't about an individual victim, it was about the symbolism of the location. The air, usually thick with the faint, metallic scent of decay and disinfectant, felt charged, almost buzzing with my own nervous energy. Around me, sealed bags held fragments of the recent past, a scrap of fabric from the riverbank, soil samples from the dig, the unsettlingly perfect stone tools found near the ancient remains. Each item, a piece of a puzzle I was desperately trying to complete. "Dean, you've been down here for hours," the detective said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, concrete space. He leaned against a tall, industrial shelving unit, arms crossed, his gaze a mixture of professional patience and weariness. A colleague, a younger officer with sharp, observant eyes, stood a respectful distance away, notebook in hand. I didn't look up immediately, my eyes still fixed on a printout of an old local almanac, cross-referenced with the legend's cryptic verses. "Hours aren't enough when a killer's operating on a schedule older than recorded history," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. I finally met the detective's gaze. "I've got it. I know what the killer's going to do next, and where." The detective pushed off the shelf, moving closer. "Lay it out for me, Dean. I'm listening." The ancient victim, the one at the dig, was buried with symbolic implements of the earth, clay effigies, flint tools. The recent victim, the one by the river, had river stones arranged around them, and a freshwater mussel shell in their hand. Both locations, both victims, align perfectly with the first 2 stages of the harvest cycle described in the old local legend. I tapped the almanac printout. The initiate, the watcher. The next stage, according to the legend, is the harvester. This ritual demands a sacrifice at a place of storage, a place where the community's sustenance is kept, to ensure a bountiful season. The younger officer frowned, scribbling in his notebook. "A place of storage? Like a warehouse? A silo?" "Precisely," I confirmed, standing up, my determination hardening into conviction. Not just any warehouse, though. The legend specifies where the bounty of the land is gathered and held before the long sleep. It's agricultural. A grain silo, a large produce warehouse, maybe even an old, abandoned factory that once processed local harvests. The detective stroked his chin, a skeptical line forming between his brows. Dean, we're talking about a folktale here. We've got real evidence, real bodies. Connecting them to a legend is a leap. A leap supported by every detail we've found, I countered, moving to a nearby lightboard, where photos of both crime scenes were displayed side by side. Look at the precise incisions on the ancient bones, mirroring the ritualistic wounds on the recent victim. Look at the placement of the bodies, the symbolic items left behind. This isn't coincidence, detective. It's a meticulously replicated pattern. The killer isn't just inspired by the legend, they are completing it. And the equinox is the deadline for this harvester sacrifice. I pointed to a specific passage in the translated legend. It speaks of the third blood, spilled under the waning sun, before the great balance shifts. The autumnal equinox. The waning sun. This isn't just about murder, it's about a ritual to ensure the land's fertility, twisted and reenacted. If we don't act now, someone else will die, fulfilling the next step of this horrifying prophecy. The detective's gaze shifted from the photos to me, then to the calendar I'd left on the table. The weight of my words seemed to finally sink in, pushing past his professional skepticism. The logical connections, however bizarre the premise, were too compelling to ignore. The meticulousness of the killer, the undeniable parallels, the looming deadline. "All right, Dean," he said, his voice losing its weary edge and gaining a sharp resolve. "You think it's an agricultural storage facility. What kind of agricultural storage facilities are there in the area? Large ones? Old ones? Anything that fits the bounty of the land criteria?" He turned to the younger officer. "Get a list. Cross-reference with any abandoned properties, any places that might be isolated enough for this kind of work." The younger officer was already flipping through his notebook, his pen poised. "On it, sir." "We need to move fast," I urged, the tension in my chest tightening further. "The killer has a schedule. And the equinox is just days away. They won't wait for us." The detective nodded, his eyes now alight with a grim determination that mirrored my own. "Then we don't give them the chance. Let's get a perimeter set, start canvassing. Every agricultural storage facility, every old silo, every forgotten warehouse in this county. We find this harvester before the sun sets on the wrong day." The silence in the basement was broken by the urgent tapping of the younger officer's fingers on his tablet, already pulling up maps and property records. The hunt was on, a frantic race against an ancient clock, driven by a legend I now knew, with chilling certainty, was far more than just a story. The hunt was on, and the frantic urgency of it settled deep in my bones. We'd moved with a speed that felt both reckless and entirely necessary. The younger officer, his face grimly determined, had cross-referenced the ancient ritual sites from the legend against modern property records, narrowing down the possibilities to a handful of locations. One, in particular, stood out, an old stone structure, long abandoned and overgrown, nestled deep within a forgotten pocket of the local state park, known only to a few hikers and amateur historians. It was marked on no official tourist map, a relic of a time before recorded history, perfectly fitting the cult's obscured legacy. "That's it," I'd said, pointing at the satellite image on his tablet, a cold certainty gripping me. Within minutes, a small convoy of patrol cars, sirens silent, lights flashing only when absolutely necessary, cut through the night. The air inside our vehicle was thick with unspoken tension, the only sound the low hum of the engine and the crackle of the police radio. This was it. The road eventually gave way to a rough, unpaved track, forcing the vehicles to slow. Headlights cut through the dense foliage, illuminating ancient oaks and gnarled undergrowth. Blood. Perimeter first. No engagement until we have eyes on. I moved with the officers, my anthropologist's instincts now honed by weeks of forensic work, my senses hyper-alert. Then, through a break in the trees, I saw it. A circular clearing, illuminated by flickering torchlight. In its center, a crude stone altar, ancient and weathered, stood stark against the gloom. And on it, a figure. The killer. Before them, another person, bound and gagged, lay prone on the altar, illuminated by the macabre glow. The victim. The ritual was underway. "Go," the lead detective roared, and the night shattered. "Police! Drop your weapon. Get on the ground." The robed figure froze, then moved with an unnerving swiftness. They didn't drop a weapon, instead, they produced a small, obsidian knife, its edge gleaming dully in the torchlight, and slashed at the ropes binding the victim. The victim let out a muffled cry. Before the police could close the distance, the killer spun, knife held defensively, their hood obscuring their face. But as they turned, a gust of wind caught the fabric, pulling it back for a fleeting second. I saw it, a flash of pale skin, a sharp jawline, and eyes that held an ancient, unsettling fire. Not the face of a madman, but of someone utterly convinced of their purpose. "You are too late," the killer's voice was a low, resonant baritone, amplified by the natural acoustics of the clearing, carrying an almost hypnotic cadence. "The blood has been shed." He didn't fight to kill, but to evade, to create distance. Another officer moved to intercept, but the killer was already flowing towards a narrow crevice in the ancient stone wall that formed part of the clearing's perimeter, a hidden passage I hadn't noticed. But the second key. It is the door. Then, they were gone. He had vanished into the earth as cleanly as a wisp of smoke. I rushed to the altar, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The ropes were cut, but no other obvious wounds. The killer had been interrupted just in time. As the officers secured the scene and attended to the victim, my mind reeled, replaying the killer's words. "The first key unlocks the door. But the second key. It is the door." What did it mean? A riddle. A clue. Another piece of the ancient puzzle, delivered directly from the mouth of the one attempting to complete it. I knelt beside the altar, ignoring the officer's shouts and the victim's choked sobs. My fingers traced the rough carvings on the stone, ancient symbols that now felt terrifyingly alive. The first key. The second key. This interrupted ritual would have been the second. But what was the door? And what did the killer mean by the second key being the door? My gaze drifted to the ground near the altar. There, almost overlooked in the chaos, lay a small, intricately carved bone fragment. It wasn't human. It was too dense, too large. Foul, perhaps. But the carving. It was identical to a symbol I'd seen earlier that day, etched into the base of one of the bone artifacts found with the ancient body. Now, here was a match. Not just a symbol, but a physical link. A piece of the same, terrible puzzle. The killer hadn't just spoken riddles, they had left a breadcrumb, a tangible piece of the prophecy. And I, Dean Blake, was now holding it, the weight of the ancient mystery pressing down on me, urging me to decipher it before the door, whatever it was, swung open for good, wild with terror, fixed on the dark opening where the killer had vanished. His breath hitched, a ragged, wet sound in the sudden silence that had fallen over the chamber. I knelt beside him, checking for injuries beyond the superficial binding marks and the ritualistic scar. The cut was precise, shallow, a theatrical flourish rather than a lethal strike. The killer hadn't intended to finish him here, not yet. This was a message, a warning, a demonstration. He said. It was a futile gesture, I knew. He was long gone, melting back into the hidden veins of the earth. My focus shifted to the altar, to the remnants of the strange powder, the carefully placed stones. This wasn't just an imitation, it was an invocation. I spent another hour documenting everything, meticulously bagging samples, sketching the layout, noting the subtle differences from the ancient site. The cult of the forgotten. A bloodline that, according to local lore, had died out centuries ago. But what if it hadn't? What if it had simply gone dormant, only to re-emerge with a modern grievance fueling an ancient rite? The drive back to the city was a blur of frustration and simmering urgency. I needed to get to the samples, to the evidence, to the texts. There was a piece missing, a crucial link connecting the ancient past to the present horror. My mind raced, piecing together fragments, the specific type of clay found at both sites, the unusual binding knots, the killer's almost intimate knowledge of the subterranean passages. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of antiseptics and old paper. Boxes of evidence lined shelves, each meticulously labeled. I bypassed the recent crime scene samples for a moment, heading straight for the older archaeological finds that had been brought in for comparison. The fragile parchment fragments, the worn ceramic shards, the bone samples from the original dig, they were all laid out on a large stainless steel table. I pulled up the digital scans of the ancient symbols, overlaying them with the photographs from the recent crime scenes. The similarities were uncanny, but it was the differences that gnawed at me. A subtle variation in a specific glyph, a slightly altered pattern in the blood spatter. Not a perfect replication, but an evolution. Someone wasn't just copying, they were interpreting, adapting. My eyes scanned the notes from the initial excavation of the ancient body. The forensic anthropologist who'd handled it decades ago had noted a unique genetic marker, a rare blood type, and a specific cranial deformity. Nothing significant at the time, just biological data. But now, it resonated. I pulled out the recently collected trace evidence, soil samples from the latest ritual site, fibers from the killer's discarded cloak fragment, a single, perfectly preserved raven feather found near the altar. I placed the soil under the microscope. It matched the ancient dig site perfectly, a specific mineral composition unique to that valley. The fibers were common, black wool, but the feather. I picked up the raven feather. It wasn't just a feather. It was from a juvenile bird, its quill still soft, its barbs not fully developed. Ravens were scavengers, but this felt deliberate. A family, long thought to be extinct, rumored to have been the last keepers of the cult's secrets. The Blackwoods. Their ancestral lands bordered the very valley where the ancient dig site lay, and their family crest, now just a faded memory in local archives, was a stylized raven. I felt a jolt, a sudden, sickening clarity. The craniofacial deformity noted in the ancient victim. I remembered seeing a historical photograph, a faded sepia portrait of one of the last known Blackwoods from the late 19th century. A slight asymmetry in the jawline, a distinctive brow ridge. It was a familial trait, subtle but unmistakable. The modern grievance. The bloodline. It wasn't just imitation, it was inheritance. The killer wasn't merely reenacting a prophecy, they were fulfilling a family destiny, righting a perceived historical wrong. The forgotten weren't just the ancient cult members, they were the Blackwoods themselves, erased from local memory, their legacy buried. I grabbed the tablet, scrolling through recent local news archives, searching for anything connected to the Blackwood name. Land disputes, forgotten claims, a family history museum that had recently closed. One article, an obscure piece from a community newsletter, mentioned a descendant, a lone individual, tirelessly working to preserve the family's legacy, living quietly on the outskirts of the valley. the ultimate ritual. It was about a specific location, a convergence point, at a specific time. And the time, according to the alignment of the stars described in the text, was tonight. My breath hitched. The rising moon, the celestial markers I'd dismissed as poetic flourishes, were aligning. The killer wasn't trying to hide anymore, they were trying to complete something. And if I was right, the blood to its rightful throne wasn't just symbolic. It was literal. The final victim would be someone of that very lineage, a sacrifice of their own blood, to fully unleash the ancient power. Dean. The lead detective's voice echoed from the doorway, pulling me from my daze. Any breakthroughs? I looked up, the raven feather clutched in my hand. More than that, I said, my voice tight with urgency. I know who it is. And I know what they're planning next. We don't have much time. The pieces had clicked into place with horrifying precision, forming a picture of vengeance and twisted inheritance that demanded immediate action. The race was on. It's the archaeologist, I stated, the words cutting through the tense silence. The one who found the initial body. They believe they are the true heir, the keeper of the cult's legacy. This isn't just imitation, it's completion. The final sacrifice will mirror the first, but with a living vessel. A ritual of rebirth, using the same site, the same methods, to awaken what they perceive as their birthright. The lead detective, a woman with sharp, observant eyes, stared at me, then at the raven feather still clutched in my hand. The dig site. They're going back to the dig site. Not just the dig site, I corrected, my mind racing through the ancient texts and the patterns I'd observed. The exact spot of the original discovery. The earth there, they believe, is consecrated. They'll be waiting for sunrise. It's a purification ritual, a new dawn for their twisted ambition. A flurry of urgent commands followed. The air crackled with a new kind of energy, a shift from investigation to immediate action. I rode in the back of an unmarked vehicle, the landscape blurring past the window, my gaze fixed on the horizon. The first hint of orange was already painting the sky. Every second felt like a lead weight dragging us down. My blood hummed with a mix of adrenaline and the cold dread of knowing how close we were. We arrived as a pale, bruised light began to spread across the eastern sky. The dig site, usually a hive of careful, methodical work, was eerily still. Floodlights from the arriving units cut through the pre-dawn bloom, starkly illuminating the excavated pit. And there, at the very bottom, in the precise location where the ancient body had been unearthed, was the archaeologist. In their hand, they held a crude, obsidian blade, reflecting the nascent light with a malevolent glint. "Drop the weapon," the lead detective's voice boomed, amplified by a loudspeaker. The archaeologist didn't flinch. Their eyes, wide and unnervingly calm, swept over us, a faint, almost pitying smile playing on their lips. "You cannot stop what is already in motion," they intoned, their voice carrying an unnerving echo in the quiet morning. "The blood calls. The cycle demands completion." My heart hammered against my ribs. There was no reasoning with this. This wasn't just delusion, it was an absolute, unshakable conviction, honed by years of studying the very cult they now sought to embody. I saw the subtle shift in their weight, the tensing of their arm. They were going to do it. Flashbangs. I yelled, my voice raw. Now. The world exploded in a blinding white light and a deafening concussion. For a split second, everything was chaos. I saw the archaeologist falter, their posture breaking. It was enough. Uniformed officers swarmed the pit, moving with practiced speed. The obsidian blade clattered against the loose earth. The bound student was quickly secured and lifted to safety, trembling but alive. The apprehension was swift, brutal, and mercifully, bloodless. I watched as the archaeologist, now subdued and handcuffed, was led away, their eyes still holding that disturbing, distant glow. They didn't resist, didn't scream, just walked with a strange, almost serene acceptance, as if their part in the prophecy was complete, regardless of the outcome. The sun finally broke the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, a stark contrast to the grim reality of what had nearly transpired. The air here was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on everything. I ran a hand over a clear plastic bag containing the obsidian blade, now tagged and catalogued. It was crude, heavy, surprisingly sharp. A tool of sacrifice, not just a historical artifact. The lead detective approached, a steaming mug in her hand. "You were right, Dean. About all of it. The motive, the location, the timing. It was about knowledge. The archaeologists didn't just study the cult, they internalized it. Every ritual, every belief, every motivation. They convinced themselves they were destined to complete the work, to correct what they saw as an unfinished prophecy. The discovery of the ancient body wasn't just an unearthing, it was, for them, a calling. The implications settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't a simple case of a copycat killer. Science had led me to the truth, but the truth itself stretched far beyond the empirical. It touched on something primal, something ancient that defied easy categorization. The lines between academic pursuit and dangerous obsession had not merely blurred, they had dissolved entirely. For so long, I had approached history with a detached, analytical mind, seeing patterns, dates, cultural shifts. But this case had ripped that detachment away, showing me that some beliefs, no matter how archaic, could still fester, waiting for the right vessel to re-emerge. It wasn't just a legend, it was a blueprint. The trauma wasn't just in stopping the killer, it was in understanding why. And that understanding left a deeper scar than any physical wound. It had been days since the last frantic sprint, the desperate race against a prophecy that had almost bled into a terrifying reality. Now, only the low thrum and the distant murmur of voices from a floor above broke the quiet. I stood amidst rows of evidence lockers, the air cool and faintly metallic, a scent I knew intimately from countless other investigations. But this time, the familiar smell felt tainted, imbued with a lingering chill that had nothing to do with temperature. My gaze drifted to a sealed evidence bag on a steel cart, containing a crude, hand-carved amulet. The detective, a man whose face was now permanently etched with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue, had placed it there for processing. He'd watched me with a strange mixture of respect and apprehension, as if I had glimpsed something he was glad to have avoided. And perhaps I had. The immediate crisis was over. The individual responsible for the contemporary murders, the one who had so meticulously replicated the ancient rites, was apprehended. They hadn't been a mere fanatic, they were a vessel, utterly convinced they were chosen to complete a cycle of blood that had been interrupted centuries ago. Their eyes, I remembered, had held a terrifying clarity, a zealous belief that transcended sanity. That was the truth that had settled over me like a shroud. The killer hadn't just imitated history, they believed they were history. The ancient cult wasn't merely a forgotten tale, it was a dormant seed, waiting for the right mind, the right set of circumstances, to blossom anew. The reveal wasn't just who had done it, but the terrifying depth of their conviction, that the legend was not a story, but a living, breathing entity demanding tribute. They had meticulously studied the ancient texts, not as a scholar, but as a disciple, convinced that the world was out of balance and only a complete, ritualistic sacrifice could set it right. It touched on something primal, a human capacity for belief so profound it could twist reality itself. The town, slowly, was beginning to exhale. The archaeological dig, once a source of fascination, was now viewed with a mixture of reverence and unease, a place where the veil between past and present had worn dangerously thin. There would be no more excavations there, I suspected, not for a very long time. The fear had been real, tangible, and though the immediate threat was gone, the knowledge of what had stirred beneath their quiet lives would undoubtedly linger, a permanent scar on their collective memory. For me, the mark was more internal. But this had been different. It had forced me to confront not just the physical remnants of death, but the enduring power of human belief, however twisted. I, a man of rational thought, had been drawn into a narrative that defied simple explanation, a narrative where ancient prophecies seemed to reach across centuries to claim new victims. I had always prided myself on my detachment, my ability to view the macabre with a clinical eye. They were vibrations, resonant frequencies that could be picked up by receptive minds, shaping their actions, dictating their fate. My place, I understood now, was not just between the living and the dead, but also between the tangible and the terrifyingly intangible. I was a translator, yes, but sometimes the message wasn't just about bones and soil, but about the enduring, often malevolent, spirit of human history itself. This specific threat was over, the immediate danger neutralized. But the legend, the cult, the capacity for such profound and destructive belief, those things were not truly vanquished. The world was full of such forgotten histories, such dormant seeds. And I, Dean Blake, would always be listening for their faint, unsettling stirrings.